My name is Oliver, and I am a polar guide and survival specialist. At 38 years old, I have seen and experienced much. The cold, unforgiving winds of Canada, the harsh expanses of Alaska, and the endless icy stretches of Siberia. I chose this profession because of my love for the wilderness and the adrenaline rush that comes from facing its unpredictable challenges. Living on the edge, where every step could be your last, is a unique feeling. Something not everyone understands, but it made me feel alive. I began working as a guide after spending several years in a search and rescue team on the Beaufort coast. It was there that I learned to survive in conditions where nature seems hostile and relentless, where one wrong move could cost you your life. I searched for those who got lost in the lifeless tundra, pulling them out of icy traps and bringing them back to life. But nothing I had gone through prepared me for what I encountered in northern Alaska. That experience changed me, made me leave the cold regions forever, and stripped away any desire to travel in the north. It was late autumn. I received a call from a man who introduced himself as John Hayes. He said he worked as a historian at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, studying the history of indigenous peoples. His voice was excited, clearly stirred by something. Hayes told me that he had recently received a package from Frostbite, a small settlement in northern Alaska, nestled between icy mountains and the endless expanses of permafrost. Inside was an amulet, small but distinctly ancient, with a strange engraving that exuded something sinister. In the letter that came with the amulet, it was explained that a local resident had found it on a glacier near the village and sent it to the professor for study. Hayes, after conducting tests, discovered that the amulet was over 1,000 years old. This discovery excited him greatly. He secured funding from the university and decided to organize an expedition to that very glacier. He invited me as a guide and survival expert. At that moment, I was out of work, and Hayes's offer seemed like a good opportunity to return to what I love: dangerous, risk-filled adventures. Without hesitation, I agreed. When I arrived in Fairbanks, the city greeted me with a cold that seemed to seep under my skin. At the airport, I hailed a taxi that took me to a small hotel near the University of Alaska. The hotel was cozy and warm, despite its minimalist interior and visibly aging furniture. Once I settled in my room, my thoughts were already consumed by the upcoming expedition. I called the professor and headed to the university, where I was supposed to meet the team that would be going with us. The University of Alaska in Fairbanks was an imposing building, surrounded by snow and cold, as if nature itself was testing whether humans were worthy of knowledge. As I walked through the long corridors, I eventually reached the room I needed. When I opened the door, Professor John Hayes was already there. He was a man in his early 50s. His gray hair and beard gave him an air of wisdom, while his eyes gleamed with curiosity and vitality, like someone who had devoted his entire life to the pursuit of ancient knowledge. He smiled warmly as I entered and extended his hand. "You must be Oliver Winters," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I'm glad to finally meet you in person." We exchanged pleasantries, and then he introduced me to the people who would be joining us. They were all archaeologists and historians. In total, there were 6 of us, 4 men and 2 women. After introductions, I began training the team. We spent several days on special training sessions, where I taught them the basics of survival in extreme conditions, how to properly use the equipment, navigate in the wilderness, and what to do in emergency situations. We trained outdoors, despite the cold and wind, to prepare ourselves as best as possible for the conditions awaiting us in the north. By the end of the week, the team was confidently handling the tasks, and I felt they were ready for the journey. The preparations were complete, and we were ready to set off. To get to our destination, we booked tickets on a plane that flew us to Deadhorse, also known as Prudhoe Bay. This tiny settlement, lost at the northern edge of Alaska, seemed to exist on the very edge of the world, where civilization gave way to endless snowy expanses. As our plane began its descent, I looked out the window and saw an enormous white plain below, covered in snow. The polar night had already set in, and everything around was immersed in a deep blue silence, illuminated only by the dim light of the moon reflecting off the snow. The sight struck me with its harsh beauty and grandeur, while also instilling a strange sense of unease. Here, on the edge of the world, you feel just how small and vulnerable you are in the face of nature. We landed on a small airstrip surrounded by snowy hills. The airport was modest, like everything else in these parts, but functional enough to serve the rare flights bringing people and cargo here. The feeling of complete isolation from the rest of the world became more pronounced. Around the airport was a small settlement, just a few hundred houses scattered across the vast white desert. The houses were built to withstand the local climate, sturdy, with thick walls and small windows that kept out the cold. Silence ruled the place, broken only occasionally by the sound of snowmobiles driving through the snowy streets. In Prudhoe Bay, time seemed to stand still, and life moved at its own slow pace. After landing, we settled into a local hotel, which, despite its simplicity, was warm and comfortable. Here, in this small oasis of coziness amidst the cold northern world, we could rest a little and catch our breath before the next leg of our journey. The next morning, after a good night's sleep and a hot breakfast, we rented snow swamp buggies, reliable machines capable of handling any challenges that awaited us on the way to frostbite. After securing our luggage, we set out across the snow-covered plain. The journey was long and difficult. The polar night that enveloped us made the road even more mysterious and dangerous. The snow buggies roared through the silence of the Arctic desert, tearing through the thick darkness with their bright headlights. Upon reaching frostbite, we finally saw the small village, covered in snow and surrounded by silence. Only a few lights in the windows hinted at life in these harsh lands. The place was both isolated and unsettling, as if time had slowed down here, and the world beyond had ceased to exist. Our guide, walking confidently through the snowy street, led us to one of the houses. It was a modest wooden home with thick walls that protected against the icy wind. As we approached the door, the guide knocked, and after a moment, the door creaked open. On the doorstep stood a man around 40, his face rugged and marked by deep lines on his forehead and around his eyes, signs of a life spent in these harsh lands. His hair, black streaked with gray, was cut short, and his slightly unkempt beard gave him a wild but trustworthy appearance. He wore a warm sweater and old yet sturdy pants that had clearly seen many winters. His eyes showed surprise, as if he hadn't expected visitors. "Good evening," he began, slowly looking us over. However, after quickly assessing the situation, he recognized the professor. "Oh, it's you, Professor Hayes?" "Yes, it's me. I apologize for the unannounced visit, Tom. I tried to reach you to let you know we were coming, but I couldn't get through." "Yeah, the reception here is lousy, but I didn't expect to see you so soon. Please come in," he said, stepping aside to let us inside. The house's interior was as modest as its exterior. Rough wooden walls, untouched by repairs for many years, were adorned with a few old photographs and hunting trophies. The air was filled with the warm, comforting scent of wood and slightly stale air, creating a sense of coziness in this unforgiving place. Tom led us into the kitchen, where there was a large wooden table and several simple chairs. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and the fire in the small stove crackled pleasantly, chasing away the cold we had brought in with us. "Take a seat," he offered, motioning toward the table, and immediately began preparing tea. The tea was simple, but after spending so much time in the cold, its warmth and aroma felt like a blessing. We savored each sip, feeling the heat return to our frozen bodies. Tom, having finished pouring the tea, sat across from us and, with a slight smile, said, "I wasn't expecting you to arrive so soon. It's a bit of a surprise." Professor Hayes, placing his cup back on the table, replied apologetically, "Forgive us for the unexpected visit, but your discovery really excited us, and we couldn't delay the trip. Could you tell us exactly where you found the amulet and how it happened?" Tom furrowed his brow as if delving into his memories. His eyes became distant as he began to recount. "I was out hunting like usual, and on my way back home I felt something strange coming from the direction of the mountain. It was a strange feeling, like something was pulling my attention. I stopped and noticed something glinting in the ice. Intrigued, I made my way over. When I got closer, I saw that this amulet was sticking out of the ice. It was made of metal and looked like it belonged to another time. At first I thought I could sell it, but then I realized it might have archaeological value and decided to send it to you." Tom smirked and added, glancing at the professor, "If you find anything else up there, I hope you won't forget to mention me." Professor Hayes smiled and nodded, thanking him for the information before asking, "Would you be able to take us to that spot tomorrow?" Without hesitation, Tom replied, "Of course. It's no trouble. You can stay here overnight. There's plenty of room." We gratefully accepted his offer, though at first we didn't want to impose. However, Tom's hospitality was so genuine that it was impossible to refuse. His kindness and openness were disarming, and we spent the evening chatting and discussing the upcoming expedition. The next morning, after an early breakfast, Tom led us outside. The sky was still shrouded in polar night, and the cold had intensified, cutting through our clothing. We mounted the snow swamp buggies and set off. Finally, we arrived at the place he had described. I glanced around. The sky was clear, and the moonlight illuminated everything, casting an eerie, cold glow on the icy slopes. The location where we stopped was flanked by two small ridges running parallel to each other, with massive glaciers squeezed in between. The scene evoked a sense of nature's grandeur, as if we had entered an ancient temple not built by humans, but by nature itself. We stood there, marveling at the cold beauty, immersed in silence, aware of how small and vulnerable we were before these majestic ice giants. After spending some time in quiet admiration, we began searching for a suitable campsite. Soon, we found a small plateau where the slope gently transitioned into a flat area. We decided to pitch our tents away from the glaciers, understanding that the ice could crack and collapse at any moment, potentially burying us under tons of frozen mass. This was dangerous, and we took great care in choosing the location. We had 4 tents, each designed to accommodate 2 people. Inside, we set up stoves for warmth to combat the biting cold of the Arctic night. The last free tent was designated as the kitchen, a place where we could gather, eat, and hold meetings to discuss our next steps. It became the central hub of our camp, a spot where we felt some semblance of comfort amidst the icy silence. Once everything was set, Tom bid us farewell, reminding us of the importance of caution. He suggested we return to the village for help if necessary. We thanked him for his support and assistance. He was a kind man, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes, betraying his worry for us. It was clear he didn't consider this place safe. Professor John Hayes, filled with impatience, barely said goodbye to Tom before heading off in search of more discoveries. I reminded him to be careful and handed him a signal flare, just in case something went wrong. The professor nodded, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a breakthrough, and he set off with archaeologist Michael Reed and historian Lisa Morgan. I remained at the camp with archaeologist David Miller and the professor's assistant Anna Johnson. The three of us began surveying the surroundings, trying to stay alert and listening intently to every sound in the cold night. The icy desert around us was both beautiful and ominous, as though it harbored secrets it was unwilling to share with humanity. We decided to explore the ridges towering over our camp. Climbing one of them, I surveyed the panorama before me. From this height, the view was stunning, yet it also evoked feelings of solitude and isolation. The endless stretches of white desert extended to the horizon, while the glaciers below resembled frozen waves of an ancient ocean trapped in eternal frost. This scene was at once magnificent and terrifying. We were surveying the surroundings, trying to find any traces that might lead us to something interesting. At first, we simply looked for unusual shapes or strange reflections of light on the ice. We paid close attention to every small sign that could indicate the presence of something ancient, perhaps hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. But no matter how hard we searched, the first day yielded no results. Professor Hayes, along with Michael and Lisa, returned looking just as disappointed. Their faces showed frustration, but it was part of the process. Success in exploration wasn't guaranteed on the first attempt. Everything seemed in order. The camp was intact, the equipment was functioning, no one was hurt, and another night awaited us in this harsh yet captivating place. However, despite the outward calm, something inside me was amiss. A strange feeling lingered, rising from the depths of my consciousness like a quiet but insistent voice. Late that evening, lying in the tent, I tried to make sense of this feeling. The cold air seeped through small gaps, but that didn't bother me. I was used to such cold. Outside, the wind gently rustled, playing with the snow, shifting it from place to place. Yet something continued to gnaw at me. After a long period of thought, I realized it was fear. A fear I couldn't explain or pinpoint. It wasn't the usual fear of being far from civilization. I had been in such conditions many times and knew how to handle nature's dangers. I wasn't afraid of the cold desert around us, the isolation, or any potential threats from the wilderness. But something deeper, more ancient and elusive, made me feel small and vulnerable. I tried to dissect this feeling, but every time I thought I was close to grasping it, it slipped away, leaving only a heaviness in my chest. I wanted to share this with the others, to talk about my thoughts, but as the leader of the group, I felt I couldn't alarm or burden them with my doubts. Next to me, David was quietly snoring, peacefully asleep, seemingly untroubled by the slightest concern. I envied his calmness and ability to fall asleep so easily in any setting. Soon enough, sleep overtook me too. But even in my dreams, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. The next day, we rose early, determined to continue our search. This time, Professor Hayes was with my team, as enthusiastic and energetic as ever, which never ceased to amaze me. Where did he find the strength? It was clearly his passion for history that drove him forward, allowing him to push through the cold, fatigue, and all the challenges. We walked along the glacier, carefully inspecting the surrounding slopes scattered around the area. Climbing the glacier itself would have been difficult, though I had brought climbing gear with me. Still, I didn't see the point. The weather favored us. Though it was still polar night, the moon shone brightly, casting a cold, silvery light over everything. It helped in our search, giving the illusion that life still lingered, frozen in time. We had covered about half a mile when suddenly we heard a shout. It was Anna. Her voice echoed across the icy wasteland, sparking hope and excitement in us that she had stumbled upon something significant. We rushed toward her, feeling our anticipation grow. When we got closer, Anna was already crouched over something in the snow, focused, her face a mix of surprise and expectation. As we approached, we saw it, a small stone grave marker, half buried in the snow. Its surface was covered in unknown symbols, strange and mysterious, as if they belonged to a civilization long forgotten. Professor Hayes froze in amazement. His eyes lit up like a child who had just found a long-awaited toy. He carefully touched the grave marker, his fingers tracing the strange symbols as if trying to memorize every curve and line. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured, pulling a camera from his backpack and beginning to photograph the find from every possible angle. Anna and the professor whispered to each other, discussing what it might be. Their voices were almost reverent, as though they were standing before something sacred. At one point, the professor took out a small pickaxe from his backpack, designed for breaking through permafrost, and began carefully digging around the grave marker, eager to uncover its secrets. After a long period of thought, I realized it was fear. A fear I couldn't explain or pinpoint. It wasn't the usual fear of being far from civilization. I had been in such conditions many times and knew how to handle nature's dangers. I wasn't afraid of the cold desert around us, the isolation, or any potential threats from the wilderness. But something deeper, more ancient and elusive, made me feel small and vulnerable. I tried to dissect this feeling, but every time I thought I was close to grasping it, it slipped away, leaving only a heaviness in my chest. I wanted to share this with the others, to talk about my thoughts, but as the leader of the group, I felt I couldn't alarm or burden them with my doubts. Next to me, David was quietly snoring, peacefully asleep, seemingly untroubled by the slightest concern. I envied his calmness and ability to fall asleep so easily in any setting. Soon enough, sleep overtook me too. But even in my dreams, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. The next day, we rose early, determined to continue our search. This time, Professor Hayes was with my team, as enthusiastic and energetic as ever, which never ceased to amaze me. Where did he find the strength? It was clearly his passion for history that drove him forward, allowing him to push through the cold, fatigue, and all the challenges. We walked along the glacier, carefully inspecting the surrounding slopes scattered around the area. Climbing the glacier itself would have been difficult, though I had brought climbing gear with me. Still, I didn't see the point. The weather favored us. Though it was still polar night, the moon shone brightly, casting a cold, silvery light over everything. It helped in our search, giving the illusion that life still lingered, frozen in time. We had covered about half a mile when suddenly we heard a shout. It was Anna. Her voice echoed across the icy wasteland, sparking hope and excitement in us that she had stumbled upon something significant. We rushed toward her, feeling our anticipation grow. When we got closer, Anna was already crouched over something in the snow, focused, her face a mix of surprise and expectation. As we approached, we saw it, a small stone grave marker, half buried in the snow. Its surface was covered in unknown symbols, strange and mysterious, as if they belonged to a civilization long forgotten. Professor Hayes froze in amazement. His eyes lit up like a child who had just found a long-awaited toy. He carefully touched the grave marker, his fingers tracing the strange symbols as if trying to memorize every curve and line. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured, pulling a camera from his backpack and beginning to photograph the find from every possible angle. Anna and the professor whispered to each other, discussing what it might be. Their voices were almost reverent, as though they were standing before something sacred. At one point, the professor took out a small pickaxe from his backpack, designed for breaking through permafrost, and began carefully digging around the grave marker, eager to uncover its secrets. We all got to work, and it took us quite some time. Each strike of the pickaxe echoed around us, and the snow turned into fine ice dust, scattering in the bright moonlight. The deeper we dug, the stronger the feeling grew that we were getting closer to something important. After several hours, our efforts finally paid off. The professor's pickaxe struck something solid, something different from the surrounding ice. It was a smooth, black stone box, buried beneath a layer of snow and ice. It was flawless, without a single crack. And oddly enough, it didn't reflect the moonlight. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light, casting a sinister darkness around itself. We instantly realized that this wasn't just a stone block. It was a chest, as there was a narrow slit in the middle resembling a keyhole. We tried to open it, but no matter how much we struggled, the lid wouldn't budge. The professor attempted to use various tools, but the box remained sealed, as though it was protected by something ancient and powerful. In the end, we decided not to take any risks by staying on the glacier and chose to return to camp, taking the chest with us to try opening it later, in safer conditions. We marked the spot where the grave marker and chest were found, intending to return if necessary. Then, we carefully loaded the box onto the sleds and made our way back to camp. When we arrived, the rest of the group was already waiting, worried about our prolonged absence. But when they saw our find, they were astonished. We brought the heavy black box into the kitchen tent, where we could finally warm up. The gentle heat from the stove enveloped us, bringing warmth back to our frozen fingers. We gathered around the box, trying to examine it more closely. But the more we studied it, the more confused we became. There were no visible keyholes or any other signs of mechanisms. The box was smooth and flawless, which left us puzzled. All 5 of the scientists gathered around the box as though it was more valuable than any treasure. Each tried to offer theories and guesses, attempting to understand what it was and how it could be opened. I, inspecting the box more closely, suggested that it might have been frozen shut, and that perhaps we should thaw it out to free it from the ice. All eyes immediately turned to me as if I had just suggested blowing it up. Professor Hayes, suppressing a smile, explained that such an action could damage whatever artifact might be inside. I simply shrugged and stepped back, deciding not to argue. The scientists, clearly engrossed by the find, continued to fuss over the box, probing it with their tools, trying to pry open the lid. But despite all their efforts, the box remained sealed, as if protected by some ancient, impenetrable force. Eventually, they gave up on the box and began having dinner. In the meantime, I prepared some soup on the portable gas stove, which everyone devoured eagerly. A hot meal in the cold desert always felt special, as though it restored strength and vitality. We sat around the makeshift table discussing the find and theorizing about its origins. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside the tent. The others didn't seem to notice, absorbed in their conversation and oblivious to the outside sounds. This alarmed me, and I decided to step outside to check what was happening. As soon as I stepped out of the tent, a sharp gust of wind hit my face. making me squint reflexively. The cold pierced through my clothing, and I could feel the wind picking up. Looking up, I saw that the sky was rapidly filling with clouds, covering the moon. It was a bad omen. A storm here, in the Arctic desert, could be a serious threat. We weren't prepared for this. Suddenly I heard a howl. It was a low, drawn-out sound, like wolves howling somewhere in the distance. I glanced around in alarm, but saw nothing suspicious, though the sense of dread was building. Earlier, I had asked Henry if there were any dangerous wild animals around, but he assured me that such predators' habitats were far from these parts, and they shouldn't be here. I stood still, listening to the surrounding noises. Maybe it was just a lone wolf that had wandered off. But as I took a few steps, I spotted silhouettes in the darkness. There were many of them, moving slowly, almost silently, as if observing me. In the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds, I couldn't make out what kind of creatures they were, but their shapes were eerily familiar. They were wolves. Fear gripped me as their outlines became clearer in the distance. I took a few steps back. However, the creatures didn't act aggressively. They simply stood and watched me from afar. Their bright eyes gleamed coldly and distantly like the night itself. There was no hunger for blood in them, only something strange, almost cautious. I stood there, transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away when suddenly I felt a hand touch my shoulder. Startled, I spun around, bracing for the worst, but instead of a threat, I saw David. His face was filled with confusion, and he asked if everything was all right. My reaction had clearly puzzled him. Realizing it was only him, I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart. My gaze involuntarily returned to where I had seen the wolves, but they were gone. It was as if they had melted into the night, leaving me uncertain. Had I imagined it, or was it real? "Did you hear that howl?" I asked David, hoping he'd confirm what I'd experienced. But David just shook his head, his expression growing even more bewildered. "No, I didn't hear anything," he replied, glancing at me with concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" What could it mean? I looked back into the distance, hoping to see those silhouettes again, but all that surrounded us was silence and darkness. The night had returned to its usual state, as if nothing had happened. The wolves were gone, and so was that feeling of an otherworldly presence. Only the cold wind and the deep silence remained. Not wanting to alarm David further or cause any suspicion, I took another glance around, but everything seemed peaceful. Without saying another word, I returned to the tent, where the others were still discussing our mysterious find as if nothing had happened. The night was restless. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, the cold seeping into my bones with every movement. Sleep wouldn't come. That strange fear which had first gripped me yesterday hadn't lessened. In fact, it had grown stronger with each passing hour, as if the darkness outside the tent was watching me, biding its time. I kept thinking about the wolves, or whatever they were, standing at the edge of my vision like shadows born from my imagination. I wasn't a superstitious man, damn it. I'd spent decades in the most remote and wild places on Earth. But this wouldn't let me rest. Something was wrong, and I knew it. By morning, I had barely slept. And when I heard the sudden scream that echoed through the camp, I leapt up instantly. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline erasing the remnants of fatigue. Rushing out of the tent, I looked around. The air was still, and the snow glistened silently under the pale moonlight. But the sound had come from the kitchen tent. Fighting through the snowdrifts, I burst inside and saw the others gathered around the box, which was now open. In the center stood Anna, her face pale, and one of her hands tightly wrapped in a bandage. She was clutching it with her other hand, her knuckles white. "What happened?" I asked, scanning her face and then the others, trying to make sense of the situation. Anna turned toward me, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and fear. She winced, her hand trembling. I managed to open the box," she stammered, her voice weak, almost breathless. Professor Hayes, panting from having rushed into the tent, hurried over to her. His eyes lit up with excitement as he began bombarding Anna with questions, demanding explanations. After a moment, she started to recount the events. "I woke up early this morning. Just wanted a quick bite," she began, her voice shaky. "I grabbed a knife to cut some ham, but I accidentally cut myself. The knife was very sharp. The blood came out fast. I was looking for something to bandage my hand with when some of the blood dripped onto the box." She paused, glancing away as if embarrassed. Then something strange happened. The box absorbed the drop of blood, like it wasn't stone but a sponge. And then there was a clicking sound and the lid started to open on its own. I got scared and screamed. Silence filled the tent. Everyone listened to her story, which seemed impossible. Yet how else could we explain the box that had been locked tight now standing open before us? The professor was the first to break the quiet, moving closer and peering inside the box. "This is..." He trailed off, simply staring inside. I stepped closer, and what I saw made me freeze in place. Inside the box lay a bone. A human bone. A hand. Or maybe it wasn't human. I wasn't an expert in anatomy, but it looked disturbingly familiar. Its broken, weathered edges suggested that it had been there for a long time, perhaps centuries. But why just a hand? Was this a burial or some kind of ritual? Aside from the bone, engraved on the inside of the lid was a strange symbol, resembling an eye. This symbol seemed to gaze directly at us, watching our every move. I could feel it stare, as if some ancient, malevolent power resided within the box. What could this mean? Someone in the group murmured, but no one had an answer. The scientists immediately surrounded the box, as if they were predators pouncing on prey. They began measuring, photographing, and recording. I suddenly felt like an outsider. There was nothing more I could do here, so I decided to scout the area. I stepped out of the tent, leaving them to their mystery, and made my way to the spot where I had seen the animals the night before. There were no tracks. The snow was fresh, and even if something had passed by during the night, there should have been prints. But around me, nothing. It was as though I had imagined it all. And yet, I knew it had been real. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. When I returned to the camp, the professor beckoned me over. His face was tense but excited. He had decided we would continue the search. This time, I went with Anna and Lisa. Anna was talkative, her fear seemingly diminishing as she shared her thoughts. Lisa, on the other hand, remained distant, pedantic, and stern. As we walked, I mostly conversed with Anna. "Ever since we arrived here," Anna began, "I've had this strange feeling. I can't describe it." I listened to her silently because I felt the same way. Fear. That primal fear we usually bury deep within ourselves. But here, in this frozen wasteland, it clawed its way to the surface. "It's fear," I finally said. "I feel it too." Her face lit up as if my words gave her the explanation she had been waiting for. "That's it," she exhaled. "It's fear. But why?" I didn't have an answer. We continued walking, expanding the search radius. Suddenly, we stumbled upon another stone, covered with the same symbols as yesterday's find. Anna and Lisa were ecstatic, like children, and rushed to examine it, taking photos. They uncovered it, and to our surprise, the box beneath was larger than the first. It was more elongated, almost like a sarcophagus. We decided not to open it there. We took the find and returned to camp. When we arrived, the other group had already found 3 more boxes. We headed into the tent, carrying the new discoveries. Professor Hayes, visibly excited, was nearly bouncing around, inspecting each box. I could see his hands trembling with anticipation. He couldn't wait to figure out what secrets these stone containers held. The professor reached for a knife. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't have time to protest. He made a small cut on his finger and dripped blood onto each box, one after another. Something clicked inside them. The boxes began to open. But the strangest thing happened right after. I heard a sound. It was a high, thin note, like a boy hitting a high pitch in a choir. The melody faded and echoed again in the silence. I froze, listening, but it seemed like no one else noticed, except Anna. I saw her eyebrows arch in surprise, just like mine. Why had only we heard it? When the boxes opened, we found more bones inside. This time they were body parts. A piece of a femur, several small bones. The professor immediately pulled out a plastic sheet and carefully laid the bones on the ground, arranging them with a near-maniacal precision into the shape of a skeleton. However, many parts were still missing. "We need to find the rest," he muttered, staring at the incomplete skeleton. Something inside me protested. All of this felt wrong. We had invaded an ancient grave, desecrated it, and were now piecing together bones like they were parts of a child's puzzle. But I said nothing. I just silently watched as they continued their measurements and research. The boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, as if they no longer held any interest. But they were still there, in the tent, silent witnesses to what we had done. The professor was in high spirits and suggested we all have a meal. We ate, and during lunch, he spread out a crude map of the area. He marked the spots where we had found the burials and said we needed to keep searching. We split into groups again. We walked through the tundra, our steps sinking into the crunching snow, and the farther we went, the more grave markers we found. Each new discovery stirred a mix of excitement and unease. When we returned, the other group had also come back with finds. They had brought 4 boxes. The professor was overjoyed. More remains, more pieces of the puzzle. We opened all the boxes, and this time David cut his hand. Inside were more bones, and the skeleton the professor was slowly assembling was beginning to take shape. However, parts were still missing. During dinner, we discussed our findings, speculating about which civilization these burials might have belonged to. The professor was in an exceptionally good mood, talking about the discoveries and how we were on the brink of something great. But I didn't share his enthusiasm. I felt like we had gone too far. After dinner, I decided to step outside. The night had fallen over the tundra and the cold bit through my skin. But I wasn't afraid of the cold. Something else was bothering me. And then I saw them again. The silhouettes of wolves. They stood nearby, silently watching me. Their eyes glowed in the moonlight, but unlike last time, they didn't howl. A chill ran through me. I didn't understand what they wanted. There was no sound, just their intense gazes fixed on me. I turned and headed back to the tent, feeling fear grip my body. "They're out there," I exhaled as I stepped inside. "The wolves. They're back." The others exchanged glances. We all stepped outside, and this time the others saw them too. I felt both relief and dread at once. I wasn't crazy, but these animals didn't leave. They stood still, like sentinels, watching our every move. The professor shone his flashlight at them, and their eyes glowed in response. We stood there, unsure of what to do. There was a palpable sense of danger in the air, and I was certain they might attack during the night. I suggested we leave, but the professor refused outright. "We're too close to a breakthrough," he said. "Maybe they won't attack. We have weapons, and if they do, we can defend ourselves." I knew that was arrogant. We did have a few rifles in the kitchen, but I wasn't fond of guns and never pulled them out unless absolutely necessary. To me, having a gun nearby meant it was bound to be fired, and not always at the right target. But now the situation was growing more tense. We kept watching the wolves, but they didn't move. It was as if they were guarding us, either protecting something or waiting. Finally, we decided to return to the tent. Outside, everything was silent when we stepped out a second time. The wolves had vanished, as if they had melted into the darkness. I sighed in relief, but the unease lingered. When everyone settled into sleep, I asked David what he thought of all this. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "Let's deal with problems as they come." It was a sensible response. I tried to set aside my worries, but as soon as I closed my eyes, sleep overtook me faster than I expected, and my sleep was deep, as if a dark abyss had swallowed me whole. I had a chaotic dream. Images flashed before my eyes, like fragments of memories pieced together, but gradually, these fragments began to form something coherent. I saw a small tribe living peacefully in their village, going about their daily lives when suddenly they were attacked by outsiders. The clashing of weapons, the screams of women and children echoed. The village seemed on the verge of chaos and total destruction. The survivors, wounded and grief-stricken, fled into the forest, hiding in the shadows of the trees, vowing revenge. The scenes shifted, and suddenly I saw a shaman among the refugees. His old, withered face was full of fury and fear. He urged the people to do something terrible. They kidnapped several enemies, those who had spared none of their families. Bonfires were lit in the clearing, and I witnessed a bloody ritual. The shaman danced wildly, as if trying to summon an ancient, forgotten spirit. His hands trembled, and his lips whispered incomprehensible words. The flames burned brightly, but suddenly, without warning, the light dimmed, as if the night had decided to swallow their rage. I felt a chill and fear, just like those people whose faces twisted in horror in the darkness. It seemed they realized they had made an irreparable mistake. Then, through the silence, a roar broke out. It was wild, inhuman, and I felt something rush through the dark. Then came the screams. One by one, they pierced the air. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. I jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, my body shaking as if gripped by a fever. I sat up, listening to my own breathing, trying to calm it down. Glancing around, I saw that David was still asleep, and I realized the night wasn't over. My heart was still racing, and my thoughts spun around the dream. What was it? A warning, or just a figment of my imagination? The dream felt too real, too vivid, to be merely the product of my mind. I dressed and stepped out of the tent for some fresh air. The sky was covered in clouds. Yesterday they had blanketed the heavens as well, but by morning the sky had cleared, and I hoped we'd get lucky again. But now, as I looked at the clouds growing thicker and darker, I realized something had changed. The wind was picking up, and the sense of an approaching storm was becoming more palpable. I wandered around the camp, thinking about my dream, trying to understand where these images had come from. But the more I thought, the more a sense of foreboding took hold of me. Hours passed before the others awoke. When they emerged from their tents, it was clear that the clouds had completely blocked out the sky. The moonlight we had relied on for our search was gone. Now we were enveloped in total darkness, as if nature itself had decided to stand in the way of our expedition. We gathered for another meeting, and the professor made a suggestion that I immediately disliked. He proposed that we split up and search alone to speed up the process. I instantly objected, refusing to allow such a plan. My heart raced as I told them that I was responsible for their safety. Sending people out alone into such a hostile environment seemed like pure madness to me. I looked at the others. No one except Anna seemed particularly concerned. It was clear that the others were tempted by the possibility of finishing the search faster. Anna stood a little to the side, clearly frightened by the prospect of going alone. But she said nothing. I suggested that at the very least we should split into pairs. This proposal was met with approval, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. Anna and I formed our group, while the others split into pairs. As much as I hated to admit it, dividing into groups paid off. Over the course of the day, we collected many bones. The professor, filled with excitement, mentioned that the human body has 206 bones. We had gathered fewer than half. There was still a lot of work ahead, but progress was evident. The weather continued to worsen, and we constantly recharged our flashlights. But the search slowly but steadily advanced. Within a week, we had almost completed the skeleton. Every evening when we returned to camp, we saw those wolves. They still watched us from a distance, never coming closer. They were like ghosts, shadows in the polar night, predators lurking in the darkness. It happened on the 7th day. We returned to camp, exhausted but satisfied with our new findings. However, we quickly realized that David and Lisa hadn't returned. My heart sank, and the anxiety grew with every passing minute. We decided to wait a little longer, hoping they would show up soon. But an hour passed, and they were still missing. That's when we decided to go out and search for them. We wandered through the hills, trudging through snow and ice, scanning the glacier, pushing deeper and deeper into the unwelcoming wasteland. Our flashlights cast faint beams into the darkness, and finally, in the distance, we spotted a dim light. It was our colleagues. We hurried toward them, quickening our pace. As we got closer, we saw they were carrying boxes. An unsettling feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. The whole scene felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When we approached, David noticed us and apologized. He said they had found the boxes late and decided not to leave them behind. I held back my initial impulse to argue, but something about his tone and demeanor seemed out of place. We returned to camp, where we could finally rest for a bit. The rest of the day was spent opening the remaining boxes and assembling the skeleton. Anna began carefully counting the bones and suddenly furrowed her brow. "There are 220, she said, "but the human body only has 206. This didn't alarm me much, as I wasn't an anatomy expert, but something about it did catch my attention. The skeleton we had assembled looked not quite human. There was something off about it. I noticed strange curves and unusual proportions. "This skeleton doesn't look human," I pointed out to the others. They nodded silently, clearly having noticed the same thing. The professor proposed a theory. It could be a primate. Look at the hands. Humans don't have claws like that, and the jaw, the teeth are too sharp. And the structure of some parts of the body is different. We exchanged glances. We were still guessing what kind of creature we had pieced together. The professor was right. It definitely wasn't human. But without a skull, the full picture remained unclear. We had dinner, discussing our findings and speculating about what ancient being could have been buried here. When we finally lay down to sleep, I turned to David to talk about the day. But his responses were off. He spoke little, in monosyllables, and his voice sounded strange, as if he was no longer present inside himself. I still couldn't shake the strange feeling I had when I saw them in the distance. Something was wrong with David, and it made me feel on edge. The next day, we set out to search for the missing skull. The day dragged on, long and exhausting, but to our disappointment, the search yielded nothing. When we returned to camp, we were greeted by something so horrifying that I wanted to grab the snowmobiles and leave everything behind, escaping this place without looking back. Anna and I arrived first and waited for the others. After a while, the professor and Michael returned, followed by the remaining members of the expedition. We discussed the day's events and, despite our fatigue, decided to have dinner. But the moment we stepped into the tent, a strange smell hit our noses. It was an unpleasant, heavy odor that I immediately recognized. It reminded me of the time I visited a slaughterhouse, a thick, oppressive smell of meat mixed with blood. At that moment, Anna let out a scream. I followed her gaze and saw something that made me freeze in place. My heart dropped, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I nearly lost consciousness from the sight. The skeleton that had been lying on the tarp in the corner of the tent was no longer just a skeleton. Muscles and tendons had begun to form on the bones, as if something was trying to regenerate the body. It was only in the early stages, but it was terrifying to see. Fragments of flesh slowly wrapped around the bones, connecting them together. It was as if we were witnessing the skeleton come back to life. I looked around, and what I saw on the faces of my colleagues amplified my own sense of dread. The professor, usually calm and composed, looked utterly confused, his face twisted in fear. Michael was on the verge of panic, clearly ready to bolt out of the tent, but I noticed that Lisa and David remained eerily calm. Their lack of reaction scared me the most. Why weren't they reacting? Why were they so calm? We stood there, unable to tear our eyes away from this creature, which continued to transform before us, trying to comprehend what was happening. What we were witnessing defied everything we knew. It was beyond reason and scientific understanding. I didn't know how to respond or what to do next. "What the hell is happening?" I finally asked, breaking the tense silence. My voice was hoarse, almost strangled by fear. The professor slowly shook his head, his eyes filled with confusion. Then he crouched next to the body, hesitantly reaching out to touch one of the growing sections. A moment later, he jerked his hand back as if he had been shocked. "It's warm," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Damn, what is happening?" No one spoke, unsure of what to say. The professor wiped the sweat from his forehead and, after collecting himself, said, "We need to observe this. Let's wait until morning and see what happens." No one could argue, though. Unsurprisingly, no one wanted to eat anymore. After that grotesque scene, all of our appetites had vanished. We dispersed to our tents, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. Something was wrong with David. He continued to act strangely, like he was a different person, and that alarmed me more and more. Morning brought even more horrors. What we saw surpassed our worst expectations. The body lying on the tarp was no longer just a partially muscled skeleton. Now we could see its chest filling out with flesh, and right before our eyes, a heart began to form. It slowly grew, pulsing as if something inside it was coming back to life. And then, that pulse turned into a dull, rhythmic thumping. Each beat of that heart echoed through the tent, the sound so loud we could feel it vibrating in the air. The thumping filled me with terror. It felt like it penetrated straight into my bones, making them tremble. We all stared at it in horror, but I could see that the scientists, despite their fear, were fascinated. For them, this wasn't just a discovery. It was a breakthrough, something they couldn't ignore. They were intrigued by what was happening to this body and wanted to continue studying it. But me? I, as a simple man and not a scientist, wanted nothing more than to run as far away from here as possible. I would have if I weren't responsible for these people. But I couldn't abandon them. No matter how much I wanted to leave, I stayed with them, even though my heart clenched with fear. I approached the professor and asked, "Do you really want to keep looking for the skull?" The professor looked at me, and for a moment I saw doubt in his eyes. Even he seemed to be afraid of what might happen if we found the skull. What would happen if this process were completed? What would we awaken? I glanced around and suddenly realized that Lisa and David were not in the tent. This was strange. I pointed out their absence to the others, but no one knew where they had gone. The weather had started to turn sharply, stronger winds, darkening clouds overhead, and it seemed like a storm was approaching. I suggested we head back, and to my surprise, the professor agreed. "We need to wait for David and Lisa or go search for them," I said, and we decided to wait. I stepped outside, and the wind hit my face with icy gusts. In the snow, I noticed footprints leading away, and from the direction, it was clear that Lisa and David had gone off together. We waited for about an hour when I finally saw their silhouettes emerging from the darkness. They were carrying a large black box. Did they find the skull? Flashed through my mind. I rushed over to them. "Where have you been?" I asked. But they ignored me, as if they hadn't heard. They walked straight into the tent and carefully placed the box on the ground. The professor frowned and asked, "Where did you find it?" David responded in an emotionless tone, "Not far. Sorry, Professor, but we were curious about it." The professor's frown deepened as he examined the box with concern. "We're not opening it," he said sharply. "Why not?" Lisa objected, her voice carrying a strange defiance. The professor pointed to the skeleton, which was now almost fully covered in muscle. "I don't know what this is, but it could be dangerous. We need to head back and report this to the authorities. I think this research is beyond our control." Then something unexpected happened. David suddenly turned, grabbed a knife from the table, and before anyone could stop him, cut his hand. A drop of blood fell onto the box. We tried to intervene, but it was already too late. To our surprise, nothing happened. The box absorbed the blood, but there was no familiar clicking sound. We exhaled in relief, but the tension remained in the air. David and Lisa stood motionless, as if lost in thought, and then, without a word, they walked outside. "What's happening to them?" I asked, my voice filled with confusion. The four of us remained discussing their strange behavior and trying to figure out what to do next. At that moment, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. It was a strong earthquake. I barely managed to stay upright, and then a deafening crash came from outside. I ran out of the tent and saw that the glacier, which had been an enormous wall of ice, had collapsed. In the center, a wide passage had opened up. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening, and then I saw Lisa and David. They were approaching the camp from the direction of the collapsed glacier. Could they have caused the collapse? I thought to myself. They walked up and headed straight into the tent. I followed behind them. The professor, seeing them, stood up abruptly, his face twisted in anger. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Lisa and David didn't respond. They just stood there, as if in a trance. Suddenly I heard a howl outside. Turning my head toward the entrance, I tried to determine where the sound was coming from when I felt a heavy blow to the back of my head. Everything went black, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, the world around me was hazy and blurred. My head throbbed painfully, and I struggled to understand what had happened. I was lying on the cold floor of the tent, and the first thing I saw was the professor and Michael, both lying still beside me. The silence was eerie, as if even the wind had stopped howling outside. I quickly looked around and realized there were only 3 of us left. The professor slowly rose to his feet, still clutching his head. His eyes darted around the tent, and I saw his face pale as he realized Anna was gone. We exchanged tense glances. All 3 of us knew in that moment something terrible had happened. "Anna's missing," Michael said quietly, scanning the empty tent. But that wasn't the only shock. The skeleton, which had been regrowing flesh just the night before, was gone. Along with it, the black box that David and Lisa had brought had disappeared too. My heart pounded faster. Clearly, David and Lisa hadn't just left. They had taken Anna and the terrifying artifacts with them. "We can't waste time," I said sharply, standing up. "They've taken her. We need to rescue Anna." The professor nodded, his face a mixture of fear and determination. He didn't know what was happening, but he understood the situation had moved far beyond the bounds of scientific curiosity. We retrieved weapons from the storage boxes, guns we had hidden away for emergencies. I checked the ammunition, the cold metal heavy in my hands. This was our only chance. Rushing outside, we immediately spotted tracks in the snow. We quickly realized that David and Lisa had headed toward the glacier, where the ice wall had collapsed. The weather was worsening fast. The wind was growing stronger, its icy gusts biting into our faces, making it hard to breathe. Dark clouds loomed overhead, signaling an impending storm. The wind howled, and far in the distance, just on the edge of hearing, I caught the sound of wolves. They were out there, among the snowstorms, watching us. We pressed forward, battling the snow, until we reached the massive opening in the glacier. It was a gaping breach, like a gateway to another world. The ice around it shimmered with an eerie glow, reflecting the light of our flashlights. But beyond the entrance was pitch-black darkness. Steeling ourselves, we stepped inside. The icy walls echoed the sounds of our footsteps, creating a chilling reverberation. Inside, it was surprisingly quiet, as if the world outside the glacier was far away. We moved forward, lighting the way with our flashlights, and soon realized that the corridors inside the glacier weren't natural. They were strangely smooth, as if someone, or something, had carved them with precision. The walls seemed unnaturally even, almost as though they had been crafted with tools rather than shaped by nature. The corridors twisted and turned like a labyrinth, but we pushed on, following David and Lisa's tracks. At times it felt like the path would end, but then it would open up again before us. Gradually, the air grew colder, and the walls became even smoother. Eventually, we came to a massive door carved directly into the ice. It was made of ice, but looked ancient, as if it had been created thousands of years ago. It seemed as though something powerful and ancient lay hidden behind it. We cautiously pushed it open and stepped inside. The room beyond the door was enormous. The ceiling disappeared into the darkness above, and the walls were covered in strange symbols I couldn't understand. In the center of the room stood a massive altar shaped like a throne, carved from a block of ice. Seated on it was a body, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was sitting. On its lap rested the black box, the one with the skull. Standing next to it were Lisa and David, with Anna held captive by David, a knife gleaming in his hand. I froze for a moment, unable to believe what I was seeing. Lisa's face was calm, emotionless, as if she had accepted her fate. David, on the other hand, looked as though he were in a trance, his eyes empty of any expression. Grabbing my rifle, I aimed it directly at him. "Let her go!" I shouted, feeling the cold metal in my hands give me a sense of control. But he didn't react, as if my words were nothing more than empty sounds to him. Then I slowly turned the barrel of the rifle and aimed it at the body lying on the altar. Its chest was almost fully covered in muscle, and the heart was pulsing visibly.
"If you don't let her go, I'll shoot it right in the heart,"
I threatened, my sights set on the throbbing organ. Their faces flickered with surprise and, finally, fear. My threat had an effect. Lisa and David clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. Finally, Lisa released Anna, and she collapsed forward. Michael rushed to grab her, dragging her back, while I kept both of them in my sights. But then, something unexpected happened. In a fit of madness, Lisa grabbed the knife, and before I could react, plunged it straight into David's heart, then shoved him onto the altar. He didn't even have time to scream. Shock flashed across his face. He clearly hadn't expected her betrayal. He clutched at the knife, and blood immediately gushed out, spilling down onto the black box. The box greedily absorbed the blood as though it was fueling its dark power. "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. Soon, a familiar clicking sound echoed in the air. The box began to open. Lisa, pushing the dead body of David aside, reached into the box with ease and pulled out the skull. I barely had time to notice that it wasn't a human skull. It resembled that of a wolf, but much larger and more terrifying. Slowly, almost reverently, Lisa placed the skull on the body that had nearly completed its transformation into flesh. Then, something horrifying happened. Lisa stepped back, gazing at the body as if expecting something. We all watched, unable to look away. The body rapidly began to grow muscles and skin, and then fur. It was happening at an unbelievable speed. Right before our eyes, a nightmare unfolded, as if an ancient beast was clawing its way out of the icy depths of hell. What stood before us was an enormous creature resembling a wolf, but there was something unmistakably inhuman about it. Its massive paws were covered in thick fur, and its claws, sharp and curved like knives, gleamed in the dim light. The massive form, sitting on the altar, seemed to preside over the icy throne, with its eyes still closed. I froze, feeling my heart pound wildly in my chest. We needed to do something. I knew that if we stayed here a second longer, this monster would wake, and none of us would leave alive. I ran to Lisa and struck her on the back of the head. She crumpled to the ground unconscious, and without wasting time, I threw her over my shoulder. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted for the exit. Anna had regained consciousness, and though shaky, stumbled after Michael, who was supporting her. We sprinted through the glacier's corridors, as if pursued by the devil himself. Lisa was light on my shoulder, but I knew she was still under the control of that dark force, and I couldn't leave her behind. As we fled the chamber, I glanced back one last time, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The wolf beast, which had only moments ago been a lifeless body, opened its eyes. Those eyes, burning bright like flames, were filled with hatred and a thirst for blood. They were the eyes of an ancient evil, awakened after centuries of entrapment. My heart froze in my chest and panic gripped me instantly. "Faster!" I yelled. I knew we had no time. We raced down the icy corridor, our footsteps echoing loudly, as if something unseen and terrible was chasing us. The cold bit through to our bones, and our breaths came out in thick clouds of steam. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, narrowing as we ran, and I could feel the creature could be upon us at any moment, its claws scraping the icy floor, its breath close behind. But at last, the corridor ended, and we burst outside. The freezing wind slammed into our faces, and the storm had intensified. The wind howled like a living entity, throwing icy needles at us. The sky was completely shrouded in clouds, and it seemed as if the very elements had gone mad. I felt something tug at my leg as Lisa suddenly woke up. She began to thrash wildly in my arms. I struggled to hold on, grabbing her shoulders and pulling her back, but she was feral, like a wild animal. Her eyes gleamed with madness, and with terrifying strength, she broke free from my grip. She collapsed into the snow, sending up a cloud of powder, but quickly scrambled to her feet and bolted forward, not looking back. Moments later, we heard a roar, an awful, menacing roar that chilled our blood. And then came the scream. Lisa disappeared into the storm. "We don't have time!" the professor yelled. I knew he was right. We couldn't afford to stop. The snowmobiles weren't far, and if we didn't reach them now, we'd never make it out. We ran, our legs sinking into the snow while the storm blinded us. Suddenly, the silhouettes of wolves appeared ahead. There were more of them now, and they were ravenous, their yellow eyes gleaming in the blizzard. I swung the rifle around and fired. The sound of the gunshots mixed with the howling wind, and the bullets tore through the snow. One wolf collapsed, but the others kept coming, gaining speed. "Hurry!" Michael shouted, and we sprinted toward the snowmobiles. I leaped into the driver's seat and slammed the door as Michael fired up the engine. The machine roared like a beast, and we hit the gas. Snow flew up behind us as the snowmobile lurched forward, gaining speed. The wolves chased us, their paws gliding across the snow, but they didn't slow down. In the distance, something enormous appeared. The creature with the wolf's skull stood in the storm, watching us. We all knew that if it decided to come after us, we wouldn't stand a chance. But to our surprise, it didn't move. It stood still, as if something held it back. Perhaps some power not fully awakened yet. Or maybe it had already fed and was satisfied with one sacrifice. The engine roared as the snowmobile plowed through the swirling snow, and soon the wolves began to fall behind. We broke free from the icy grip of the storm, and suddenly, the realization hit us. We had survived. Somehow, we had made it. None of us knew why, and none of us could fathom what that creature had planned. Perhaps it had consumed Lisa, or maybe its full strength hadn't yet been restored. But we weren't about to stick around to find out. Hours later, we arrived in Frostbite, exhausted but alive. The first thing we did was notify the authorities about everything that had happened. The next day, a team was dispatched to investigate the site, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing left. No bodies, no traces of Lisa or David. It had all vanished, like a nightmare. The professor was devastated. He understood that we had unleashed something that should have remained sealed. We didn't know what the future held, but everyone could feel it. Something terrible had been set free. Perhaps long ago, someone had trapped that creature to prevent it from ever escaping, and we, driven by our thirst for knowledge, had broken the seal. From that day forward, it became clear that these lands were no longer safe. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the vast white wilderness of the frozen expanse, and what it would do next, no one could predict.